seem to be always living in a time of shattered hope. Always. In 1960, John F. Kennedy, a Massachusetts senator was elected to become the 35th President of the United States. Kennedy was then and remains the youngest person ever to be elected to that office, and the youngest to die in office. His youthfulness, his idealism, his handsome appearance, his moving personal and family history caused many people in the United States and across the world to hope for peace and justice. But those hopes were shattered when on November the 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated while riding in an open motorcade in Dallas, Texas. Shattered hopes. In 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., co-pastor with his father of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, was awarded the Nobel Prize in the field of human rights for his leadership in civil rights and social justice. Dr. King was only 35 years old at the time. His advocacy for civil rights and social justice and peace through nonviolent change challenged the United States and inspired social justice movements around the world. However, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, April the 4th, 1968. Shattered hopes. In 1976, Jimmy Carter, a former governor from Georgia, was elected to become the 39th President of the United States. His humility and his down-to-earth manners prompted many people to hope that public policy in the United States would be defined by peace and justice. President Carter embraced women and persons of color. He convened a historic summit involving President Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel at Camp David that resulted in the first treaty of peace and cooperation between Israel and any of its neighboring Arab nations. But President Carter was defeated in his 1980 bid for re-election by Ronald Wilson Reagan, former governor of California. In 2006, Barack Obama wrote a book titled The Audacity of Hope. In his 2006 book, Mr. Obama, who was then a United States Senator from Illinois, set out his vision and views on what he termed a new kind of politics based on cooperation, a shared sense of community, and a conviction that we can work together to improve life for all persons. And in the fall of 2006, The Audacity of Hope became a bestseller. It reached the #1 position on both the New York Times and the Amazon.com bestseller lists, after the book was endorsed by Oprah Winfrey. Barack Obama later became a candidate for President of the United States. He won the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. Ultimately, he was elected the 44th President of the United States. And his election was viewed in this nation and across the world as a hopeful sign for justice and for peace. And after leading the nation to enact the Patient Protection, don't forget that, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Don't leave the Patient Protection out. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. President Obama was re-elected in 2012 to a second four-year term, and at his inaugural for his re-election, he took his oath of office while holding his hand on a Bible that had been owned by, yes, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. After President Obama served 2 terms in office, Hillary Rodham Clinton ran for office, the first woman to run as a candidate for any of the major political parties. Former Secretary of State, former First Lady of the United States, former Senator from New York, Hillary Rodham Clinton demonstrated and exemplified, whether you agree with her politics or not, the hopes of so many people, not just women, but certainly including women, that we would be able to, as a people, embrace leadership irrespective of gender or sex or any notions of male privilege. But in November 2016, Donald John Trump was elected President of the United States, the 45th president. And this New York real estate developer, television celebrity, who was elected on a campaign slogan of Make America Great Again, was elected after a campaign that was defined by white religious nationalism, hostility toward people who were immigrants and Muslims, people who were disabled, people who were sick, all of the persons who were marginalized. Reverend, why are you recounting all these experiences? I do so to try to allow us to identify with the two men who were walking to Emmaus from Jerusalem in that passage that Terry Jeffries led us in reading. You recall those two men. One of them is named Cleopas. Cleopas. The two men were followers of Jesus in some respect. But unlike other men who had followed Jesus and had remained in hiding, these men left Jerusalem. They were not hiding in Jerusalem, they left Jerusalem. Unlike the women who followed Jesus throughout his ministry, who supported his ministry, who followed him to the site of his crucifixion, who watched him suffer and die, who watched his dead body be buried in a borrowed tomb, and who returned after resolving to pay homage to him, returned days after his burial. These men left Jerusalem. Unlike Thomas, who was not hiding with the men and who was not going with the women, these men left Jerusalem. Why? Why? Luke's gospel gives us a clue. After they were joined by a third person they did not recognize, who asked them what they were discussing as they walked along, their reply is found at Luke 24, verses 19 to 24. We read their reply: "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in word and deed before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Close quote. These men suffered from shattered hope. Those of us who were alive and remember what it was like the days after President Kennedy was assassinated can identify with them. Those of us who are alive and remember the days after Dr. King was assassinated can identify with them. Those of us who are alive and remember what happened, how we felt after Jimmy Carter was defeated in 1980, can identify with them. Those of us, if I jump add one other thing, that were alive in 2000 and remember how the votes were stopped counted. And George W. Bush was declared President of the United States based on votes that were not counted and votes that were thrown away. Can identify with them. Those of us who were alive in November 2012 after Hillary Clinton was defeated can identify with them. We can identify with them. Those people who had hoped that after all of the effort to get health care passed, and after all of the effort to get health care enacted, and after all of the effort to get health care funded, had gone through, can identify with them. It is important for us to put Scripture in present context. And so we need to put ourselves in this text. Okay? And let's just be honest, we're not Jesus. We're not the stranger who comes up on these two people and asks them, what are you talking about? We're the two people. We're Cleopas and his unnamed companion. We are the people of Shattered Hope. We are the people who identify with Cleopas and his friends. Like Cleopas and his friend, we have held high and noble hopes. Like them, we have seen our hopes shattered. Like them, many of us have appeared to have thrown up our hands in disappointment and confusion and disgust. Cleopas and his friend were not hiding in Jerusalem. Cleopas and his friend were not hanging out with Thomas wherever Thomas was. Cleopas and his friend were not hanging out with the women. Cleopas and his friend had left town. They appear to have decided to throw in the towel. They had seen Jesus ambushed by their own religious leaders. Their own people had turned on Jesus. Their own people had turned Jesus over to the Roman occupiers of Palestine. Their own people had falsified evidence to accuse Jesus with the crime of insurrection, a capital offense. Their own people had done all this after bribing Judas, one of their own people who had turned on Jesus. After seeing so much corruption, after seeing so much dirt, Cleopas and his fellow disciples essentially decided to hell with it. I'm leaving town. This gig is up. After they had hoped so much in Jesus and seen him do so much for their own people, only to be rejected by the very people he had served, these men were done with the religion of Jesus. They were done with hope. It may be tempting to criticize them for giving up. We who have the advantage of knowing what, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story, might be tempted to look down on Cleopas and his friend. We might be tempted to think, where was their faith? Why did they leave Jerusalem? Even after hearing the report from the women who said that Jesus was no longer dead. Do you have those thoughts? In case you had those thoughts but were afraid to voice them, I voiced them for you. But are we so different? Are we so different from Cleopas and his friend? Have we, like them, heard about the risen Jesus and still given up? Have we, like them, heard about the power of the resurrection, and heard that despite everything that the principalities and the powers of empire and pride did to Jesus, God raised him up, have we, like these men with shattered hope, also been tempted to quit on Jesus anyway? Not going to vote. My vote doesn't count. I don't care what they do. I'm sick of it. I don't trust any of it. I'm through with church. I'm through with religion. I'm through with it. Fill in the blank. Shattered hope can cause us to quit believing God will make a way. Shattered hope will cause us to quit believing that anything we do can make a difference. Shattered hope can cause us to quit believing that anything we do for God and with God even matters anymore. Shattered hope can cause us to believe that we need to leave what we were called to do. We may have felt we were called to do it at one time, but shattered hope can cause us to say, I'm going to quit this. I no longer want to live out this calling. Shattered hope can cause us to stop trusting people we once trusted. And shattered hope can make us blind. Shattered hope can blind us to realities that contradict and refute our sense of hopelessness. Shattered hope can blind us to the presence and the power of God, even the presence of power of God walking beside us. Shattered hope can blind us as God is talking with us, can blind us to the presence of God listening to us, can blind us to the presence of God comforting us, can blind us to the presence of God challenging us. Shattered hope can make us blind to the power of God. Shattered hope can make us blind to the truth of God. Shattered hope can make us blind to the unstoppable justice of God. So much so that we'll leave town. We'll check out. I'm done. My soul is in park. My soul is not in drive. My soul is in park. If I'm going to put it in gear, I'm going to put my soul in reverse. My soul ain't going to go in drive. No, my soul is not going in drive. Drive requires too much energy. Drive requires hope. Drive requires that I believe that there's something to go to. And that God is going to be with me as I go. No, I'm going to put my soul in park. And if I do have to shift into gear, slap it in the reverse and go back. Shattered hope can make us blind like that. Well, if you wonder if there's a cure to shattered hope, there's good news. Look at somebody and say, watch for the third man. Watch for the third man. You do understand that in this story, the people with shattered hope were joined by a third person. A third person. And the good news is that even when we have shattered hope, even when we have checked out, even when we have left Jerusalem, even when we have said, to hell with it, there's a third person shows up. A third person shows up. When everybody has said there's nothing else can be done, a third person shows up. A third person shows up. Even when we cannot recognize that person, they show up and says, what you down about? And we look at them and say, what's wrong with you? Don't you know what I'm going through? A third person shows up and listens to us as we complain, listens to us as we cry, listens to us as we grieve, listens to us as we vent our frustration, listens to us. Had we sing it, I love the Lord, he heard my cry and pitied every groan. Long as I live, when trouble I will hasten to his throne. A third person shows up. That's good news. That's good news. The good news is that even when we are blind to God, God shows up. Even when we have checked out on God, God shows up. Even when we have said to hell with God, God shows up. Even when we have turned our back on what God wants us to do, God shows up. Even when our enemies believe God ain't around us no more, God shows up. That's good news. That's good news. Well, the third person who showed up to Cleopas and his buddy joined them in the power of God's resurrection. God finds us even when we've thrown in the towel. God finds us even when we quit the field. God finds us and hears us, finds us and consoles us, finds us and challenges us. God will not abandon his people of shattered hope. God will not abandon God's people no matter how shattered our hopes may be, no matter how dry our souls are, no matter how long we've been in park, or no matter how far in reverse we decide to drive. In the risen Jesus, God finds us. In the risen Jesus, God helps us understand that some suffering is part of every liberation movement. Let me say it again. You may have missed it. In the risen Jesus, God finds us and shows us that some suffering is part of every liberation movement. What Jesus did was he walked with them through the scriptures and said, from Moses to all the prophets, that this was necessary. Some suffering is necessary. Put your head around this. In the risen Jesus, God shows us that not even God can save us without suffering from the powers and principalities of human empire and corruption. God has to suffer. Now that's deep. That's deep. But in the risen Jesus, God shows us that God has to suffer. And so God in Jesus says, if God does not check out, you can't check out. If I am not checking out, as God says, if I don't check out, you can't check out. Because you understand, God in Jesus shows up with Cleopas and his buddy after they have checked out. And God, who has not checked out but is checked back in, drops in on them to enlist them back into the business. That's good news. That's good news. In the risen Jesus, God shows us that not even God can deliver us without some suffering. In the risen Jesus, God shows us that even when the principalities and powers appear to have done us in, God still has us. God still has a way out of our no way. God still has a way out even when there is no way out that we can see. God is still working even when we've given up. And even when the principalities and the powers seem to have risen up and railed and seem to be ruling over us, God will still have the final word. Because Jesus showed up at Emmaus on that road, shattered hope was eventually replaced by open eyes. Because Jesus showed up and drew men with shattered hope into a burning heart fellowship, they could not keep leaving Jerusalem. They had turned around. They had walked all the way to Emmaus. But after God showed up, they had to turn around. After Jesus showed up, they decided, hey, we got business in Jerusalem. After Jesus showed up, they said, hey, we don't have any reason to stay in Emmaus. We're going to leave dinner time. and go back to Jerusalem. After Jesus showed up, God got them back in the business. And when they got back in the business, they found out that the fellows were talking about the same thing that Jesus told them. That God had showed up. You see, God doesn't just show up for you. He shows up for her, and for her, and for me. And sometimes I don't know God has shown up for you, but God has shown up. And sometimes the only way I know God has shown up in your life is if I go back to Jerusalem where you are already saying, the Lord showed up. Well, let me get down so you can go on. When Jesus becomes real, we go back to work. When Jesus becomes real, we will not quit when people persecute us. When Jesus becomes real, we will not dismiss reports about what God has been doing in the lives of others. We will not treat what the reports about the women as just idle talk. We'll say, hey, the women got some news about Jesus. I need to be listening to this. When God is real, when Jesus shows up and becomes real in us, people of Shouted Hope become people of resurrection truth and resurrection justice and resurrection hope. And we are called to be these people because we are the people in whom Jesus has shown up. Go back to Jerusalem. Go back to Jerusalem. Go back to Jerusalem no matter what the principalities and the powers are doing or threatening, and go back to Jerusalem and say, hey, we have been with Jesus and therefore we are not quitting. We have been with Jesus and therefore we know God makes a way. We have been with Jesus and we know that sin does not win. We have been with Jesus and we know that justice will triumph. We have been with Jesus and we know that love conquers all. We have been with Jesus, and we know that no lie can outlast the truth of God. We have been with Jesus. Hallelujah. Let's go back to Jerusalem. Amen.